Andre, how will AIFMD impact on outsourcing by fund managers forming part of bigger groups?
Before replying to that question, I just want to say that being a lawyer doesn't mean you have all the answers. Fine when you ask your questions. Insofar as the question is concerned, outsourcing, just as a sort of basic premise of the directive, outsourcing is allowed in the directive as much as it is allowed in other EU directives. I think the tricky bit is the extent of the outsourcing, and this is where the level 2 measures should be, the level 2 regulation should be focusing more. So far, what we have in the main directive is that the manager cannot delegate or outsource functions to the extent that it renders itself into a letterbox entity. And that sounds very reasonable, because ultimately, why would you want to be regulated in any EU member state, whereas your model and your business model and the functionalities of your fund management firm are being delegated totally to another fund manager or to another member of your group somewhere else in the EU or even outside the EU. A point to mention here on EU versus non-EU delegation or outsourcing, the directive allows both. So there is nothing in the directive precluding a fund manager delegating or outsourcing functions to a non-EU based entity. Now, the extent of that, and this is where I think particular attention needs to be given more than we've done maybe in the past, to agreements, to the contracts, to the outsourcing agreements between the manager and the outsourced entity. Because the agreement, first of all, would be key in the eyes of the regulator to determine whether, in the case of Malta, in the case of the MFSA, whether the Maltese fund manager is actually a letterbox entity or not. If a manager renders itself into a letterbox entity, the directive, I think, is very clear. It just says you're no longer an AIFM. Now, in the context of a current operation, which would fall within the directive once it comes into force, if you are today a fund manager and your systems and procedures are basically pushing you towards total outsourcing, full outsourcing, where you are a letterbox entity, once the directive comes in, there is the big danger that you suddenly fall outside regulation. If you are not regulated, then you can't service the AIF. If you can't service the AIF, you obviously have a big issue. Now, historically, over the years, the MFSA has adopted MiFID rules to outsourcing, which normally apply to MiFID firms, and they have rendered them applicable even to the fund managers, which I think was a wise approach, although we do grumble sometimes, with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, because that approach should fit very nicely in the outsourcing rules which one expects to see at level 2 regulation level. So insofar as the Maltese fund management community is concerned, I think where I must say that outsourcing is quite normal, is very popular, I think we won't be facing an earthquake. Maybe we might need to tweak a little bit. We might have a grey day along the way in our horizon coming to July of next year. But I don't think it will, the directive will impact the outsourcing arrangements of the local fund management community to a great extent.
Andre, your firm advises both fund managers and administrators. What are your views on the new responsibilities imposed on managers relating to the fund administrator?
I think, well, the directive really is focusing on the added responsibilities of the fund manager for valuation. Now, as was mentioned before, the administrators are not necessarily valuers or valuation agents. They typically put together the net asset value, but they are not necessarily valuing the assets. However, I think that the current model, which we are normally used to in the alternative investment space, has to change. The current model, the way I see it at least, is that the fund typically enters into two agreements. It enters into a fund administration agreement with the fund administrator, and it enters into a separate and distinct fund management agreement with the manager. That contractual arrangement has to change because of the directive, because the way the directive is structured, it implies that the fund manager is assuming responsibility for both functions. However, it can then delegate the valuation to an external party. So the way, at least, we have been discussing it at the office, and the way we see it, is that these two agreements need somehow to dovetail into one. And the way we are thinking of restructuring these contractual arrangements for our clients is by going down the route of tripartite agreements, where both the administrator or the valuation agent and the manager will be a party to the agreement together with the fund, where, and this is where it starts getting, again, tricky, insofar as how will we then describe the way in which the manager is assuming certain responsibilities and delegating others. And this agreement won't be a fund management agreement. There will be a separate agreement for fund management. This would be an agreement for fund administration, or maybe an agreement split into parts, with one part tackling the fund management bit, and the second part tackling the fund administration bit. But still, I mean, this is very much work in progress. So I think the main impact, apart from the liability and responsibility point of view of the manager for valuation, is also at the contractual arrangements.
Looking at the more commercial side and less the contractual side, I think AIFM gives an opportunity to service providers, because fund managers' core competency is fund management. Their core competency is not regulatory reporting or investor level reporting. Their competency is fund management. And I think both on the custody side, with custodians acting as depositories, and increased level of risk, increased level of control, increased level of reporting. Same thing on the fund administrator side, increased level of reporting, investor level reporting. I feel that service providers who are able to develop a model where this is straight through automated kind of reporting and invest in that will benefit actually from AIFMD, and will actually get more outsourced services which today don't exist from fund managers. So actually this is increasing the level of services that will be required in the market, and those who can actually start delivering them in a low cost manner will actually win the game.